have been at pains to indicate that the committee is still hearing submissions from the ministry departments and agencies, and we will soon embark on the submissions from external stakeholders. But I have taken away from the queries and the questions asked of me an urgency that the society feels, has in relation to the work of this committee. And so I'm just relaying that to my Senate colleagues in this committee. We hope to sort of step up the schedule so that the stakeholders that are to deliver submissions, we can make decisions about dates and time and have a sort of flow that speaks a little bit more urgency, with the hope that we can get through those submissions in the coming month. So I'm just putting you on notice. I think I did on the last occasion. I know Madam Clerk had sent out some dates and asked members to just indicate their availability. Madam Clerk, you had gotten responses? I don't think we got responses from all members, so I would just ask members to pull up that email. Madam Clerk, if you can just resend it, so it's at the top of the email chain, so that members can indicate their availability so we can schedule the dates, because remember, we are not the only committee meeting, and so getting time and space in the chamber is a competitive process. So if you can respond to that so we can settle our schedule in the coming month. It was 3 dates, wasn't it, Senator Gill? 2 dates. So the 2 dates proposed so far was the 13th and the 27th of May. Very well. With that said, and given that the Ministry of Labour and Social Security is outside, I'm going to ask members to allow us to defer the minutes until the end, and to have the Ministry of Labour and Social Security deliver their presentation. Yes, please invite them in. Again, members, I would just ask on the online platform, we monitor the online platform to see if you wish to make an intervention. If you could just use the raise hand feature, and we will acknowledge you. And if, well, in the chambers, members know the protocols here, just for good order and so that we're able to identify the speakers in our coverage of the meeting. Okay, members. Want to welcome Madam Permanent Secretary and her team from the Ministry of Labor and Social Security, Permanent Secretary Jennings, and I see the chair of the National Senior Citizens Council, Dr. McCoy Davis, and Ms. Cassandra Morrison, who is it the executive director? Is that the title? Yes? Okay. And if you, P.S., I am doing your introductions. Why have I taken over your job? I beg your pardon. Please introduce yourself and your team.
Morning, everyone. Thanks for having us from the Ministry of Labor and Social Security. And from the ministry, we have with us our Chief Technical Director for Social Security, Mrs. Audrey Dare-Williams, to my left on the second row. And beside her is the Director of Social Security, Ms. Suzette Morris. And to the far left is our Senior Legal Officer, Mr. John Paul Watson. Beside him, Ms. Cassandra Morrison, Mrs. Cassandra Morrison, the Executive Director for the National Council for Senior Citizens. And beside me is the Chairman of the Board of the National Council for Senior Citizens, Dr. Julian McCoy Davis.
Thank you very much, P.S. And just so members would know, they should have gotten it via email. We had asked some questions of the ministry on the last occasion that they were before us, and they have provided responses to those questions. For flow and ease, I have asked the Permanent Secretary if she would address the questions at the relevant places in her presentation. So members would have had a chance to take a look at it, and you can sort of skim it now. P.S. if you could just ensure that the answers are addressed as you deliver your presentation. And with that, I will ask you to begin. The presentation is going to be loaded via the Zoom platform. Is that how we're going to do it? Yes. All right. Just crave your indulgence, members, as we just get the presentation loaded.
Okay, and just to note, Chair, that the presentation will be shared by myself, the Chairman, and Mrs. Morrison. So while we're waiting, just to note that in 2018, we had a green paper for the National Policy for Senior Citizens, and subsequently 2 years later, we had the advocacy by the National Council for Senior Citizens, the need for a policy revision. And with the cabinet submission that was done, and in 2021, we had a revised National Policy for Senior Citizens, which was tabled in this House. And in that, we have the implementation plan, which includes legislation for the protection of senior citizens. And in 2022-23, we continued that advocacy, and we had the board position on the case for legislation for care and protection for senior citizens. We note in 2024 that the Senate approved the motion to formulate elderly care and protection, and during that time, during that same year, the Minister of Labor and Social Security requested that we also establish a committee, a working committee, to look at the same matter relating to elderly care and their protection. So in 2025, on March 11, we appeared here in the Senate, and the committee has started its work with its meeting April 22 this year, and there are a number of areas that would have come to our attention for review based on the consultation with board, and also based on consultation with some senior citizens. And I must indicate that there is need for further consultation as we move towards looking at legislation for their care and protection. So we have the policy, and the vision of the policy is to ensure that senior citizens live and participate actively in the society, guaranteeing their rights, promoting their responsibilities, recognizing their capabilities and contributions, and facilitating their enjoyment of a life of fulfillment, health, and security. Senior citizens is defined by the UN, and we utilize the UN definition, 60 years and older. In terms of the provisions for care and protection, there are certain areas, certain legislation that are currently in place that impinges on the...
Madam PS, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. Can we get that presentation loaded so that it is a little bigger and more visible, please? We do have this projected on the PBCJ channels.
They're on page 3.
One of the parliamentary team could give some assistance.
Is that you?
A moment, members, while the IT personnel come to give some assistance. Thank you. Yes, while we're waiting for the IT technical people to come, go ahead, Senator Gale.
In the meantime, can I just ask 2 questions?
Yes, I was about to ask one myself, but go ahead.
Madam PS, the committee, it's a working committee of internal component within the ministry, or does it give rise to the extension of external stakeholders being part of this working committee?
Chair and members, the committee is set up by the ministry, but it incorporates persons external to the ministry.
External to the ministry.
So we have representatives from different agencies.
Yes.
We also have representatives from the board, which that board comprises of various stakeholders widely represented.
I would just want to ask, given the nature and the construct of the ministry in terms of its principles, that is of a tripartite nature, I'd want to suggest and recommend that this working group may consist also of employers, representatives, and worker representatives. And given the fact that, we operate under the guidance of the Labor Advisory Committee. The second question I'd want to ask in relation to the currently legally age defined. There was another ministry that appeared before us, the Ministry of Health, and they made a recommendation in suggesting an increase in the retirement age. Would your ministry consider that? And specifically, where you stated there's no law that outlines a retirement age that normally is dependent on the employer. I don't know, and John Paul Watson is here, maybe under his recommendation and guidance, whether or not the ministry would want to look at a particular legislation that signals an intention to stipulate a retirement age. Bearing in mind the NIS Act that speaks to the eligibility criteria of 65 years or 70 years to be more in line with that kind of progression. So I would want to ask the ministry if they would consider that, certainly in the near future. If it has not already been done.
Right. Member, the discussions continue, and in that same committee that I mentioned, it's one of the things that is on the table. So when we conclude our deliberations, we will be indicating our recommendations from such committee.
Morning, thank you.
Senator Dr. Longmore, give me one moment, please. Senator Morris had his...
Okay, sorry.
Had indicated to me he wished to make an intervention. Senator Morris. Are we hearing Senator Morris? All right. I'm not hearing Senator Morris. Senator Dr. Longmore, go ahead for a moment, please.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, and thank you for being here. Out of curiosity, the committee that you mentioned, do you have health, especially mental health representatives there? First part of the question.
We do not specifically have mental health, but this committee can incorporate other members based on the areas that are being discussed. And I know one such area would be dementia. That's right. High on the agenda.
Yes, so why I brought that point is if you go to the other end of the spectrum, where age of consent, age of responsibility for illegal action, etc., etc., it is dependent on, basically, these parameters are based on the development of the brain and the functioning as an adult. And so there's a graduated approach in terms of responsibility and age of responsibility. And likewise, why I would suggest that you definitely have that input, and particularly mental health input in that deliberation, is that it is the capacity to perform and to function. And more we're recognizing that, 60 is the new 40, 70 is the new 50. And it is in terms of retirement age, and I'm very glad that Senator Gale raised it. It is the capacity to function. And I'm lamenting the deficit of health and especially mental health input in some of these legislative and policy directions. So I'm just imploring that, please, that you include that in your consideration. Thank you.
So I must also add that we have the representatives from the Ministry of Health on the board of the NCSC, and so this committee liaises with that.
And I will also tell you that the Jamaica Psychiatric Association is always able and willing to make themselves available, if I may say.
Certainly, we can
Thank you.
welcome that. So,
P.S. Given the technicalities, the technical difficulties we're experiencing, if members would allow me just to suspend the sitting for 5 minutes to allow the technical people to get us loaded. Thank you. No objections? All right, members. It appears we can resume. Madam P.S. has indicated that she can address some of the questions that were asked in the last meeting while we wait on the technical team to get us loaded with the presentation. Madam P.S.?
thank you, Chair. So in terms of the additional data on the number of senior citizens benefiting from social pension and the national insurance scheme, you wanted to find out exactly what those numbers were. And under the national insurance scheme, we have 130,307 senior citizens benefiting from that scheme. And under the social pension, 16,089. On PATH, we have 63,120 persons. So we have a total of 209,516 senior citizens benefiting from all those programs. In terms...
Just a quick question. Is it possible that persons can benefit from a combination of them too? 2, 3, or just...
Okay, so those on social pension, which is a newer program, do not, 70 and over, 75 and over, 75 and over, do not benefit from PATH and or NIS.
Okay. But
we do have some persons on PATH, because you know that's an older program, where we have senior citizens.
And they would also benefit from the NIS too?
No.
Possibly?
No. Persons on PATH do not benefit from NIS or social pension.
Right, okay.
Just a follow-up. Those benefiting from NIS assume that they were contributors. Make the distinction for me for those who are on the social pension that comes at a particular age. What would have been the distinction? Because there may be persons that were contributors to the NIS that would have elevated to social pension. What's the distinction? They were never contributors?
So those on social pension, the eligibility criteria, they should not be on PATH or receiving a pension.
Or
so
receiving
we don't
a
have,
pension.
Right. So,
it assumes that they were never contributors?
Yes, they were never contributors. Okay. Or if they were contributors, they are not in receipt of NIS. So they wouldn't
but
be.
But if you're a contributor, it follows to flow that you should have been benefiting from the NIS if you were a contributor.
If they met the requirement.
If they met the requirement.
Right. If they met the requirement under the NIS, then they would be getting a pension.
Right.
Right. So those on social pension would not be receiving NIS or PATH.
I understand path.
Okay.
And path is very clear. The cloud in my mind is that distinction between benefiting from a social pension. It would mean that you're out there, you were never contributing to any scheme, or you weren't employed and a contributor. Case in point, a contract employee, yeah? To be benefiting at this stage. But I just wondered if there were any persons who, at this new ceiling cusp of a few years ago, in terms of this new dimension, if they were ever contributors to the NIS. Maybe you don't have that kind of data.
That we may
but
have to look into.
If it's a gap, then somehow we'd have to determine why the exclusion.
No, so
Because I'm looking at the social pension, taking into consideration those who were never contributors, but should benefit from a new kind of program. But if it would have nothing stopped short of giving you added pension money, rather than where you are contributing to the scheme and benefiting. So that's something that we may have to look at if there's a gap anywhere, and we might want to plug that gap.
Thank you. Okay, so just following on that, and just for clarity, because it is that important. So with the definition of being at 60, but retirement being at 65, what age does the NIS start benefit?
NIS starts benefiting at 65.
65, okay.
But persons can work up to 70.
Okay, can work up to 70.
Right.
Okay.
So when
but still get the benefit?
So they get the benefit at 70.
At 70, all right. Social pension is at 75. And path for the elderly?
Same 60.
60, all right. Now, you said that once the persons meet the requirements and were contributors, they would benefit from the NIS. Now, I, in my ignorance, would think that being a contributor was enough to meet the requirements. Are there persons who would have contributed but don't meet requirements? And what happens to those individuals?
Okay, Audrey? I'll ask my CTD to
Thank
answer.
you.
Yeah.
Good morning, Chair and members. So persons can contribute. To get the benefit, you must have a minimum of 10 average weekly contributions per year, which amounts to at least 520 weeks of contribution. If you don't have enough contributions to meet that requirement, you will not get a pension. You get a one-off grant.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So there is a provision of a one-off grant, but then they would possibly qualify for the social pension or path at another juncture.
Right.
All right, great.
So
Thank
they
you.
could. But I want to mention that how we have structured the benefit, we try not to disincentivize contribution to the scheme. So the social pension is set at half the rate of the lowest NIS rate.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much.
Right, because remember we have graduated rates depending on the number of weeks contribution in the scheme. Right.
Senator Floyd Morris wanted to make an intervention. Is he able to hear us? Is he able to speak? Are we having challenges with the online? He is online, and he did indicate to me. Okay. Just asking IT to check that for me to see if all is well. Go ahead, Senator Gill.
Yeah, I keep raising these.
Your mic, please.
Yeah, I keep raising these concerns in terms of the qualification for a threshold in that nature. 10 years. And we have seen gaps where persons would have been disadvantaged because of the scope of employment that they have. A contract for service, or in cases, contract of service, but the employer does not put them to qualify to contribute to the NIS scheme, nor in the private sector a pension scheme because of their type of employment being contractual in nature. And I would have seen where persons join the scheme or join a pension at the latter stages of their life and end up with a minuscule amount in terms of pension arrangement. So it broadens the focus now of us looking clearly at how we treat with contract workers and their eligibility to be able to contribute to these types of schemes. Yeah? And so they don't have to be depending on the social pension solely at age 75. Again, there's a gap in terms of when you start benefiting. It assumes that you never get nothing for some years, and at this stage of your life, because you are lucky enough to be alive, you can now qualify. So we really, Mr. Watson, look seriously at our contract employment arrangements.
Chair. Morning, Chair and members. Just one query, Senator. When you are referring to contract workers, you're referring to both independent contractors and as well as employees who will be hired on contract?
Let's first talk about those who are employed on contract. The independent employees now we have to take on differently, giving them an option to be able to contribute to fulfill the mandate of the schemes, just like NHT, yeah? Because what you want is a population that reach a particular age to be able to benefit under the rubric of these provisions. Thanks, Chair.
Well, under the law, generally speaking, even if you're an employee and you're hired on a contract, your employer is under duty to, in fact, make relevant contributions because you're employed. You can't necessarily contract out of the law, so the contributions ought to have been made.
The further question is, a moment, Senator Gale, if I could, and I concur with counsel, the further question, though, is in instances where the ministry has discovered that an older person is unable to benefit because they do not satisfy the threshold requirements, what action does the ministry take? Does the ministry see itself having an obligation to correct the ill that has occurred? And you know, certainly we've seen it where contract employees and contracts, and those contracts are often written with the employee taking on the obligation of satisfying statutory payments like NIS, NHT, etc. But that does not remove the duty of the employer to pay the employer's contribution over to the relevant agencies. When the ministry is aware of that, when the National Senior Citizens Council becomes aware of that, what action is taken in relation to the employer who has now caused this older person to be in this circumstance of not being able to qualify?
In relation to that, we encourage compliance at all times. So where a citizen applies and based on our records, there are not sufficient contributions to allow them to get a benefit, we revert to the employer. However, there are circumstances where the employer may no longer be in existence. And so there is that challenge, because then the ministry, if we are able to identify the employer, we will allow them to give us the records to illustrate that the person did contribute. Admittedly, the person would be at a disadvantage if, for instance, the employer is no longer in existence. And we find that happens from time to time. So what we do now is encourage employees from now to ensure that the employers are remitting their contributions, because there will come a time when they will apply for their benefit, and we want to be sure that the ministry, the scheme, would have received those benefits. So we do have an active compliance program in the scheme, and in fact, we do take employers to court where they are not in compliance. So we have that activity that is done in every parish. Every employer is subject to a compliance visit or a regular inspector's visit by our inspectors in the parishes.
Can you tell us what amount of cases you may have currently going through the system? And if you don't have that information today, could you supply us with that information?
No, unfortunately, I don't have that offhand.
I wouldn't expect you to have it offhand,
Yes.
CTD.
Yes.
But
So
if you could just provide us with that.
we can.
Very well. Members, there is a 12 o'clock meeting in the chamber. We have an hour. So I want to ask if we could just allow the ministry to get through the presentation, injecting the answers to the questions, and then if you could just note your questions. I'm not barring members from interrupting, but I'm just asking you to be mindful of the time constraints. Go ahead, Piers.
All right, in terms of the number of elderly persons directed by the ministry to apply for assistance under Section 12 of the Maintenance Act, and whether any assistance has been provided. The council has in their records 27 senior citizens who were referred to legal aid services. However, none of the referrals were related to the maintenance orders. Based on the experience of the NCSC with seniors, what recommendations would the council propose to close all the gaps identified and ensure that seniors are able to be maintained and could access the legal system? Senior citizens do not readily opt to make applications for maintenance orders for several reasons, and these are not limited, but these include fear of conflict, and the process is perceived to be stressful and conflict-ridden and not necessarily worth their while. Some of them think. There is a matter of shame, some persons feeling ashamed to ask for support to bring these matters forward. There's a lack of awareness of their legal rights and the process involved. So we know that some of them do not know what their rights are, but there is the work of the NCSC ensuring that they are sensitized in these areas. There are, of course, matters relating to legal requirements and also lack of access due to not having their dependents assisting them where they require that. So there is a need for greater public education for seniors to understand their role in obtaining this process under the maintenance order, and the need to strengthen the legal support for them. And consideration, we note, should be given in empowering them to act on their own behalf. So this is one area that the council has been working with seniors in ensuring that they are apprised of the rights that they have under such legislation and what assistance the council can give them in bringing their matter forward. The other question relates to, is there a data collection system already in place to assist in tracking the conditions and well-being of seniors? And maybe I should just ask the executive director to just summarize this response. And the next one.
Yes, good morning, Chair and members. Right, so the National Council for Senior Citizens maintains an in-house database of vulnerable seniors or senior citizens who have chosen to be registered with the National Council for Senior Citizens. And that has been the method by which we track senior citizens.
Is there a discrepancy between the numbers you have on your database and the numbers of senior citizens recorded by Staten? And what kind of gap do you have?
There is, Madam Chair, because registration with the National Council for Senior Citizens is voluntary, and so not all persons who are 60 and older will opt to be registered with the council. We find that the majority of seniors who register with us are usually at some point in time benefiting from a service that we provide. And so it is customary that seniors who do not necessarily engage with us or participate or benefit or access a service from us, that they are not necessarily registered with us.
Chair, I know we're pressed for time, so I just have to ask this quickly. Is there any alignment with the health services for this registration, the NHF, the health centers? That's a key point of contact for the elderly population. I'm wondering if there's any alignment with that.
Right, so the council works very closely with the Ministry of Health and Wellness, with the Health Promotions Unit, the Health Promotions Department, primary health care, particularly family health, and that is usually the main way in which we engage with senior citizens. Elderly health falls under family health primarily within the Ministry of Health and Wellness. And so we have various areas of collaboration. The Ministry of Health assists us with health and information fairs, with screening, with access to drugs, and so on. Right.
Chair, you asked a question about the numbers in Staten as opposed to the numbers in the registry, which is key because it may mean that if we get that type of information, then we know where the variance lies. Is there a kind of program that promotes increasing in registration, and has that been helpful enough to increase targets? Because if people don't know what service you provide, they might not want to participate. People might believe also that there are kind of a segment in society that don't really need this, but they don't know what benefits can be derived. So is there a kind of promotion targeted towards increasing that number in registration?
And I have the same question for agriculture, elderly agriculture.
Right.
Old-time farmers.
Yes. So one of the main ways, because the council has, one of our challenges, human resources. So one of the main ways that we implement our programs is through stakeholder collaboration. And so we have to work smartly with other entities and with our own parent ministry, other departments. And so public assistance, PAF, social pension, NIS, we participate and collaborate in their activities to target those senior citizens. We sit on various committees at the parish level, including those with the Board of Supervision, Poor Relief, and the municipal corporations, so that we can target senior citizens in that regard. We also work very closely with churches and community groups, the SDC, CDCs, as well as, yes, RADA. RADA does a lot of training and workshops with us and assist us to identify not just senior citizens who are farmers, but their families and vulnerable seniors as well.
Members, can we ask PS to continue? Thank you.
So, Chair and members, on the question of elder abuse, the Council received 134 reports of elder abuse between 2019 and 2024. The majority of these cases were financial abuse, followed by neglect and abandonment, physical abuse, emotional abuse, which often accompanied the other forms of abuse, and 2 cases of sexual abuse. In terms of the perpetrators, reported to the Council over the same period, the majority were family members, accounting for 77 of the 134, followed by caregivers of older persons. And for the most part, these caregivers were paid caregivers. Right. Strangers accounted for the 3rd most prevalent, and persons who were close contacts but not family members of senior citizens were the smallest group. Yes. Yes.
For our own consideration, when you look at the type of abuse, we may have laws that treat with physical and sexual abuse, clearly dependent on associated legislation to treat with those. So maybe for our own consideration now, those under neglect, abandonment, and financial, we may have to consider how we incorporate any provisions going forward. I'm just making that mental
yes,
note.
Yes, and I agree with you, Senator Gale, and I just think, too, that I'm sure that there's a difficulty in meeting the evidentiary burden of these cases sometimes because of either inability of the older person to speak to what has happened or fear and unwillingness to speak to what has happened to them. And that's something that also is a challenge in relation to cases involving children and minors. It's something that I think we need to consider in making proposals for a law, because it's not just to say there must be a law to punish those who abuse elders, but we have to think even more practically about what that process is like once a complaint is made or even a charge laid. The authorities have a hurdle to cross in meeting the evidentiary burden in those cases. And there also, of course, has to be a balancing of the rights of the accused as well. So some members will have some meat to grapple with when we get to our deliberations. Please, go ahead.
Question, and I said it just in passing, but I'm curious in terms of the financial abuse and scamming, because you hear how many of our elderly are victimized in that way. Does this figure reflect those maybe with the JCF, is there collaboration with what may be reported on the criminal side of things? Because for me, for 5 years, for it to be only 8 strangers considering what we hear out there, I'm curious.
Remember, though, Senator Longmore, that these are matters reported to the council.
Yes, I understand. That's why I'm wondering that this perhaps does not truly reflect the situation that our elderly face.
Yes.
And so we need to have as much data collaborated for us to have the real picture.
I agree with you.
Thank you.
So in terms of how the council treats with these cases that would have been reported to us, we do understand that there is no law that empowers the National Council for Senior Citizens to investigate reports of elder abuse, but as the entity that concerns itself with the well-being of senior citizens, the National Council for Senior Citizens has utilized social work interventions to deal with these cases, to promote the care and the protection of senior citizens. And so we have and continue to work very closely with stakeholders, including the JCF, entities of the Ministry of Labor and Social Security, as well as the Ministry of Justice and other stakeholders, the Poor Relief Department, and so on. So a case of elder abuse that is reported to the council, we attempt to respond within 24 hours of receiving such a report, and an attempt at assessment of the senior citizen situation by a social worker is activated. We try to determine the entire situation of the senior citizen, their economic, financial situation, their family situation, their health, and the social systems and support that is that supports the senior citizen. Cases of physical abuse often require a senior citizen to make a complaint. And there are instances for which we have engaged the police and a senior has refused to give a statement of the abuse, right? And this is usually, most times, due to their dependence on the abuser or the particular situation that they find themselves in out of fear or the limited options they have, or genuinely out of shame or pride sometimes. We try to identify a suitable, a family member who is willing and committed to the care and protection of the senior citizen, and to work with the family to see how best we can support them to improve the senior situation. There are instances where families are genuinely in need of social support, whether it is financial or it's access to services, including health services. Sometimes it is stress, caregiver burnout, lack of support from other family members, and so on. And so where we can use these types of social work intervention to work with the family, in some instances, the situation of the senior improves. There are other situations where there's infighting among family members that impact on senior citizens, and in those cases, mediation and interventions through the Ministry of Justice generally sometimes will assist with the situation. There are times also when a senior may be required to be placed in a nursing home or some other type of residential facility, And there are also situations where family members may assist a senior to remove the abuser from the home. And so the senior ages in place in their own home. There are times when there is no family member, and in those cases, we try to support the senior if their desire is to age in place. There are other times when we'd necessarily need to engage with the poor relief department in order to get the senior into the infirmary. There are times when the space in the infirmary is not available, and so we have to support the senior in their situation and try to improve it as best we can, whether with support for food, for health care, in terms of assistance from the Ministry of Health and Wellness, the community health aides to visit. We often have to link with, sometimes church members are the only available options for support, as well as our own senior citizens groups that offer support in terms of visits.
Just for clarity, these that are now reported, they become part of your registry, so there's a continuous track on them?
Yes. And we treat them as, well, cases. So
as
we
cases.
follow up to make sure that even when they go into the infirmary, if that is the remedy to the situation, we follow up to make sure, to find out how they are coping there and what their situation is.
But if you treat them as cases oftentimes reach to a point of closure.
Yes.
But the registration now would give them additional support.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thanks, Joe.
P.S., can I ask you to just resume the presentation and to inject the questions in the middle? I'm looking at the time, and I'm concerned about the time. So while we have the list of questions and responses, if you could just proceed with the presentation. You had started it. I think we got just to the first or second slide. And then where relevant, you can just inject the responses to the questions.
Thanks, Chair. But we have been answering, so maybe we could skip the presentation and just continue with the questions.
No, I prefer if you do the presentation. Okay. It seems to have the meat we were looking for on the last occasion.
The last, okay.
Thank you.
All right. So the other... No.
I think we had gotten to, you had indicated to us a definition of a senior citizen, and we were moving on from there when I stopped you. The next page I have is legislation, provisions for care and protection.
Oh, okay.
And I'm doing it this way, P.S., because while some of the information that we're getting is important for our consideration, I want to be very clear about the mandate of this committee, and it is proposals for a law. So while the programs that you have are important to understand in the context of crafting those proposals, some of that information is not going to be what we consider as information that is required to have a legislative purpose, result, facility for protection of the elderly. Some of those are programs that have to be dealt with administratively. And I think your presentation probably addresses our mandate a little bit more directly. So if we could look at that.
Thank you for clarifying and emphasizing, because that's exactly what I have written here. So I must intervene with this. Where you said no law currently exists for the agency to investigate. Now, I have to reflect: once a man, twice a child. If you have an elder who is abused, who is cognitively not able, shouldn't there be something that chips in where the authority is able to make a report or see to that being investigated on behalf based on the lack of capacity? And I'm intervening here about this because that is what we do for our children. And the primary reason we do that, again, is because of the capacity of the child. So whilst we are reflecting on laws, I think that this is something that we need to consider, where if the elder is in a state of mind that they're not able to do this on their own, at least then there should be some compulsory reporting that the council is able to make. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Longmore. PS your presentation, please, and you can address that point when you get to the case.
Okay. All right, so while legislation, we think that it is very important to cover areas such as elder abuse, senior citizens' rights, and caregiving. And some of these that I'm presenting would have been out of the discussion of our committee. In terms of the implementation gaps, when laws are enacted, they are not effectively enforced or fail to achieve their intended purpose. So it is very important to ensure that there are trained personnel. We have a reduction in term. We ensure that there are enough sufficient resources for monitoring and support. And in terms of legislation, we noticed the Maintenance Act, the National Policy for Senior Citizens as a policy that would be grounding the, any legislation that would emerge. We also have the Nursing Homes Registration Act of 1934 and the regulations of 1976. In terms of the regulatory gaps, where there are existing laws and they fail to adequately address a specific area of activity or control, then there needs to be areas that are considered to respond to those. So some of the areas that have been identified would be assisted living facilities, senior centers, daycare and daycare activity centers, incoming in-home caregiving services, community-based services, and the whole matter of practical nurses. So the legislation then would be able to strengthen the policy and to ensure that it is legally binding and can be enforced. There is a greater accountability and transparency, and there's clear implementation and guidance as to how we can proceed in reducing ambiguity and ensuring that the policy is applied effectively and consistently. And it also allows for the policy to be further refined and ensure that there is the full resource allocation and oversight governance that would be necessary. So in terms of the scope of the legislation, the National Council for Senior Citizens, of course, its mandate is mainly to provide services as outlined in the policies, which includes services such as social engagement and participation, stakeholder engagement and collaboration, support for senior citizens and groups, education and training of the senior citizens, referrals, elder abuse investigation, case management, which is one area that we are promoting, monitoring and evaluation of policy implementation, advocacy, research, caregiver support. And in terms of the senior citizens, older persons, we want to see them as an advocate. And maybe this is one area that the legislation could provide for, them being a watchdog.
Who is it them you're talking about? The council?
The council.
You are proposing to us that the council be the entity that acts as a senior citizen or the older person's advocate? Is that what the proposal is?
The proposal is that there is a senior citizen's advocate.
And who would that be? Would that be somebody different, an entity different from the council, or is that
Entity or person, yeah, different from the council.
Okay.
So that person would be independent and would be reporting to the parliament. I guess that is similar to other legislations that exist. And they would have the responsibility, administrative, consultative, investigative, legal, regulatory, and other responsibilities. And the scope of the legislation, one of the other questions that was asked of us, has to do with the matter of the tribunal. And
can you just explain, PS, what the tribunal is and what they do for those who don't know?
okay, so The question was, if a tribunal were to be established to deal with rights of elderly population, how the tribunal would work, particularly the mechanisms to be utilized before a case reaches a tribunal, and how they would be brought to the tribunal who would bring the cases to the tribunal. So what we were looking at is something that is similar to the Disabilities Rights Tribunal. And in that tribunal, we have the Disabilities Rights Tribunal has been established to deal with complaints and settle those matters relating to persons with disabilities, and that would be a similar thing for the provision if it were included for the senior citizens. And in that situation, an aggrieved person can make a report to the council. In this case, it would be the National Council for Senior Citizens, and they would trigger an investigation. And the parties would be invited for arbitration or mediation, and the matter would be resolved. But where the matter is not resolved, it can be referred to that tribunal for any alternative resolution. But I could ask Mr. John Paul, our legal officer, to compare the provisions under that tribunal to what we're looking for the...
Senator Gill, before you come in, I just want to be clear on something, because we had discussed in previous meeting the concept of a senior citizens tribunal somewhat. But what I want to understand clearly, is the ministry agreeing this as a proposed way forward, or is this a part of what you are recommending to us as what should form the framework for the support of older persons in the community?
We're seeing it as an option.
Okay. Senator Gill.
An option for consideration. As we had indicated, these recommendations are still being refined, so, but it's something that we could consider.
I just, I'm looking at it holistically, in that if we are to come up with a kind of legislation, the legislation would have to be overarching in nature, which takes into consideration some of these options, and the role of the tribunal itself be confined as a provision of that legislation.
Yes.
Save and except the concerns raised that would be triggered to a tribunal would not necessarily include physical abuse and abandonment, because those are at a particular threshold that has to be treated separately in my mind. So I would like to see in the future, and it's work in progress, Chair, what the proposed legislation from their standpoint would look like. But I assume that that would have to come later, because you're still working through those dynamics.
Yes, thank you, Senator Gill.
Yes.
Go ahead, Pierce.
Okay, and one other area that under consideration would be the Senior Citizens Registry. That is something that is already in the policy, and the legislation could consider the inclusion of such a registry. And it is proposed to be a tool used and maintained by the National Council to identify, target, and to facilitate access of senior citizens to programs and services. Senior citizens.
Members, if you're going to make an intervention, let's do it in the correct way, please, so that we can have the mic on. Senator Longmore, you wanted to make an intervention?
I was checking, well, I'm trying to ease the time. I see you have the reference to Case India here with respect to the tribunal question. Is there something specific about that you would want to make here? A specific point about their approach legislatively?
About what?
Case India, you have it listed as a possible approach, I think, to the tribunal operations.
Okay, so yes.
Clarity,
It's just-
please, PS. Senator Longmore, you're looking at the questions, or
So
you're
I'm
looking
looking
at the presentation?
she mentioned regarding the tribunal, and there is a question that we had asked about that. So she was basically making reference to the first part of it, but there's also a second part around Case India.
Yes, go ahead, PS.
Right. So, Case India, the Maintenance and Welfare Parents and Citizens, Senior Citizens Amendment Act of 2019 establishes a tribunal to hear applications for maintenance and provide expeditious disposal of maintenance applications with special preference for persons 80 years and older. And it constitutes special police unit for senior citizens, establishes senior citizens helpline, application to the tribunal for maintenance by 3 avenues, and some other aspects. So Case India is just one of the case study that we are looking at, and then out of that we can make a determination in terms of what we could recommend for the legislation.
What is it that commends Case India to you? And calling it Case India for the benefits of those listening, it's just the scenario in India.
Yes, the act.
Yeah, what is it about that, the features that you've just listed that commend this as something that we would look at? I mean, I'm looking at constitute special police unit. I mean, I see the Minister of Finance cringing right there. What is it about this, the features of this, that you would be commending to us?
Well,
why?
Maybe not all aspects, Chair, but we just referred to that legislation that actually treated with the establishment of a tribunal for senior citizens. We're outlining the scope of what that legislation has. But we also made the comparison with what the Disabilities Rights Tribunal has as well. So out of the further refinement, we would be settling in on the recommendations that could be considered.
Go ahead, Piers.
And seeing the same with the Older Person Tribunal in the Cayman Islands. That was established in 2024, appointed by the cabinets, and has other responsibilities. We are still trying to get further information on that one.
Is it that Older Persons Tribunal is a temporary tribunal? Oh no, you say it's established under their Older Persons
Amendments Act. It's a part of the Act,
so it's
2024.
So it has now
Cayman.
become a part of the executive framework to deal with older persons'
In
complaints?
Cayman. Yes. They hear and determine complaints filed with the tribunal under this Act and in accordance with the procedures that they would have set out. And they are empowered to compel the production of documents and any other matter or thing from a person, public authority, non-profit organization, private entity that the tribunal has reasonable grounds to believe is breaching any relevant provision of their Act, among other areas.
And is it that these tribunals that you're suggesting would look at all kinds of complaints in relation to older persons, or is it that the matters that come before the tribunal would be limited to matters of a particular nature? How would that work? Is Council John Paul? Go ahead.
Yes, Madam Chair, I believe.
Just pull your mic down and you.
Oh yes. So I believe that we would have to carve out what particular types of complaints which would come to the tribunal in Jamaica. Certainly, you know, if we're going to consider, for example, maintenance, which is a very big thing, we're going to have to consult largely with the Ministry of Justice to see if that's something they would be attuned to or likely to agree to. Also with the Attorney General's chambers. It's a bit different, but if we look at what goes to the IDT, which is Industrial Disputes Tribunal, industrial disputes are defined, so it's categorized. So it's not every particular dispute between an employer and an employee can be referred to the IDT. So I think that's what we would have to do as well for this particular tribunal, if that is the road that we're going down.
I'm particularly intrigued by the concept of a tribunal that would have a more arbitrating sort of role, because immediately it comes to mind that the hearings of that tribunal would necessarily have to be confidential hearings, which may very well provide older persons with more confidence and lower the bar to them making a complaint if they know they can come before a tribunal and the matters that they're dealing with before the tribunal are not going to be public matters, so to speak. So I would love to understand. Is that the scenario with the Disability Rights Tribunal? Does anyone know? We have anybody here from LRD today? Oh, yes. I'm so sorry. Ms. Roden, are you aware whether or not the Disability Rights Tribunal holds its hearings in a confidential setting? No? Okay. I just wondered. Thank you, Mr. Counsel.
Maybe.
I guess I was going to say I don't believe that they hold it in a confidential setting per se, but maybe I should clarify what you mean by confidential. So
meaning the hearings are not open to parties outside of the hearing. It's not like a court. I can walk into a court and sit down and listen to the proceedings, but I can't walk into a tribunal hearing necessarily and do the same.
Yeah, it is my understanding that it is in fact confidential, but I can double check.
Yeah. Okay.
You see, Chair, why I like the idea of the tribunal, it gives the opportunity for a report to be made. And that report is treated in two fashions, whether you hear the issue and make a judgment, but it also, there's one of the suggestions that give rise to a level of mediation. So you can work it out with the family member. Now, this provides, in my mind, a sense of comfort, as opposed to you go up to the steps of the police station to report it, and it attendance to some grievous harm after that in terms of further victimization. So I'm seeing where in the first instance we have to define those concerns that triggers the report to the tribunal to be heard and not to overload the tribunal in the first instance. So I'm liking the exploration of this tribunal once we can kind of define that role and the specific issues that are being heard.
Yeah. And Senator Gale, it occurred to me as well that in the, arbitration is one process. Mediation, of course, is a voluntary process. It's a process where you want people to choose to sit down together and to work to some sort of middle ground in a confidential setting. I wonder, though, how a tribunal like this would work, because if you're looking to mediate, parties have to be willing. But you're also giving the tribunal, or it sounds like you would want this tribunal to have powers of a quasi-judicial body, meaning they have the power to compel witnesses, they have the power to summon witnesses before them, and so to parties. And I would just ask, how would that work? Is it that the mediation part of the process would be something the tribunal could do to suspend their process to allow for mediation in similar to the way that the court does it now? What exactly is being conceived here?
Yes, Madam Chair. What I would say is that, in my mind, we haven't reached a definite determination on how it would work, but it could be conceptualized in a similar manner to what is happening at the IDT.
Right.
So, for example, when two parties have a dispute, generally speaking, the ministry would invite them to conciliation if they fail to come to some form of agreement at the local level. So it can be applied similarly here. So, for example, you could invite the elderly person in, along with the person who's accused of abusing them, perhaps, or whoever they have the issue with. Certainly, it should be a voluntary process, so we would invite them, but we could not force them to come. And perhaps this could be done by the council or particular officers who may form part of the advocate they're under. You could have a discussion with them in a mediative setting, and if you come to an agreement thereunder, then that agreement can be written up, signed by both parties. However, if there's no agreement, then I believe, or you cannot settle the matter there, then I believe at that stage it would then be, could refer to the tribunal for their determination of the matter. Notwithstanding, that wouldn't preclude that if the matter does go to the tribunal, that proceedings could be halted if the parties wish to engage in some form of discussions. Because in fact, that does occur at the IDT now.
Right. So we get do we get two bites of the cherry in terms of the course in labor, at mediation at the Ministry of Labor, and if it's sent to the tribunal, I believe under its own rules, give rise to suggesting to the parties involved whether or not they are willing to continue some level of mediation. You know, it's always good and well that, you know, it's better you work something out rather than it's dependent on an award or a judgment itself that you can't really deal with. So I'm seeing giving this opportunity at the level of this kind of tribunal to do that. It may assist and aid in mending fences between those who are the perceived perpetrators and the victim being the elderly. Yeah? That kind of mechanism we'd want to support.
Thank you, Chair. Again, I'm likening to the situations in child abuse and reduced capacity also. So I think I personally will reflect on the Child Care and Protection Act and the functionings of tribunals there, and also the sexual harassment bill that we had just concluded. But I think that we don't need to, I think those are good references with respect to the functioning and the two tiers that we may have to consider with respect to the elderly. Those who have full capacity and those who may have a reduced capacity and functioning. And so I think that the committee perhaps should reflect on those two pieces of legislation for guidance in how, and also a third, because I think, if I were to remember correctly, I think the Mental Health Act also has reference to a tribunal too. So I think those are maybe legislations that we can reflect on. Thanks.
I smirked, Senator Longmore, when you mentioned that Mental Health Act. That is so in need of reform, and we have been calling for it in so many different fora. I know I've heard you for a long time. I'm going to make a request to our Legislative Council if she could just take a look at the various tribunals under the Act and just give us some guidance as to how they work and how they function in terms of their mandate under their Act, just for comparative purposes for when we get to our deliberation section. All right, members, we have literally 10 minutes, 11. So, P.S., please continue.
We just have 2 more points, Chair, because we would have incorporated some of the responses before. And we have 2 relating to the wandering registry and the other autonomy of senior citizens, which I'm going to ask the chairman of the board to speak on.
Pull the mic down to you, Dr. McCall. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Okay, so in terms of the wandering registry, wandering, not wondering, not thinking. All right. Yes, could be both. So we're basically talking about persons who have possibly mental health conditions, and as such, they are prone to wandering. And so what we are suggesting to families is the establishment of this registry. And so if you have persons who may have a condition in which they are prone to wandering, that you make, you do a voluntary registration by providing a one-page information with for example, a photo of the person is very important. And, you know, some persons may not have recent photos, but as recent photos as possible. And also that this information be shared with the police. And so when it is that someone reports a loved one missing, then we can easily, from the police perspective, the JCF, then action can be taken readily through the sending of a BOLO, which is beyond the alert, beyond the lookout notice, so that can be relayed to local and national agencies. And then a media release as well as social media posts can be made to ensure that that information is circulated in a timely manner. Because it's very important for that kind of information to be shared quickly, considering the fact that some older adults with certain health conditions, once they go wandering, if they're not on medication for a particular time, then it can lead to other health conditions. So it's very important for action to be taken quickly. And so one of the discussions that we've been having at the board level is the whole matter of the normal course of contacting the person. The police, for example, when someone goes missing, and normally they're waiting for the 24 hours to identify someone as missing. So we're saying in this case, we want to act much quicker than the 24 hours. So we want to have that in place, right, if they have certain health conditions. So that action can be taken quickly and the appropriate intervention can be made.
Is that something for a law or is that an administrative system? I know we have the Ananda alert now. Mm-hmm. I'm not quite sure how that works in terms of the voluntary nature of it, whether it is a registry or an alert. But you're talking about something that's a volunteer system. So is this really appropriate in a law?
We would need to be advised by our legal team on that.
Well, Madam Chair, without doing any further detailed research, I believe it would be more something that I would recommend to be administrative, but certainly we can do some research to see what is best practice. But by the fact that it is a voluntary registration, and due to the nature of the purpose of the actual registry, I think it should be something that's more administrative.
Thank you.
Chair, if I may, again, with the distinction of diminished capacity, if you have someone who is not able to themselves, right, I think that there should be some provision by the state for their care. So that 24 hours for somebody who is not in their right capacity, 24 hours can be quite damaging. So I think we should consider perhaps that dual approach.
The concern what I would have making it a law is that it's going to mandate a behavior and expectation of both sides, the family member or even caregiver, to be compelled to report a part of a registry, something that is in the first instance voluntary in nature. This is one of those prescriptions, Chair, that we might have to strongly encourage, not making it law, but strongly encourage and, you know, educate and activate a kind of approach, just like the Ananda alert.
The difficulty that we have to grapple with it is in this committee, is that being an older person is not equivalent to being a person who is unable to make decisions for yourselves. All older persons are adults. They're of majority age. And so It is when we come to talking about maladies that reduce the mental capacity of the older person that they then fall into that vulnerable category. So we have to be very careful that we are not talking about instituting something in a law wholesale that is going to govern all older persons, because all older persons, like middle-aged persons, like young people over the age of 21, have their autonomy by right, have their constitutional autonomy, like we all do. So when we get to deliberations, that's something we definitely are going to have to be very careful about, the balancing of rights and protections. But as it is now, when you talk about something that is a wandering registry that is dependent on voluntary registration, that does not appear to me to be something that you propose for legislation. And you can't compel someone to register, even with diminished capacity. I'm not aware that the state could in any way seek to compel them to be a part of that type of program. So we have to think about that, and that's something we may ask legal reform just to give us some guidance on when we get to the point of deliberation. Senator Longmore.
Because I wanted to be brief, I didn't right now say exactly what I was thinking, but actually there could be a solution which is not legislative, which is through the centers that deal with, quote unquote, the wandering patient. So we have dementia clinics all over the island, and we are going electronic. What also could happen is that we encourage our healthcare practitioners to periodically, and families, to take pictures, to take a picture as a part of their health record. And that way we're keeping in touch with that type of awareness of the individual, particularly based on their predisposition to wandering. And so I think that there's also that collaboration that could happen with the facilities that provide care for those persons who are prone to wandering, and encouraging the caregivers, both in the home and in those facilities, to keep up-to-date records so that if somebody goes missing, it is a quick activation of trying to identify the person, etc.
Thank you, Senator Longmore. Pierce? Oh, sorry. Was it Pierce or Dr. McCoy?
I think you finish.
Go ahead.
Finish, right?
I note you have some things included here in relation to rights of an older person vis-a-vis the autonomy of senior citizen. Could you talk to us a little bit about that in relation to how you wish, what you're proposing in terms of a law?
So, Madam Chair, the committee is considering whether or not there needs to be specific legislation concerning the rights of older persons as it relates to issues of discrimination, social exclusion, and abuse. And so whether or not persons are discriminated as a result of their age, and also their ability to, you mentioned autonomy earlier, so that is something that we want to look at as well as life and dignity in old age. So we, from a committee perspective, we have been looking at the proposed legislation from a rights-based perspective, and also to determine whether or not we're talking about constitutional versus statutory rights, and if statutory rights, what should be included. So just to say, it's something that we are currently discussing. I know the whole issue as far as autonomy is concerned in relation to, for example, issues of power of attorney as well as guardianship are critical matters that we want to address as well.
Go ahead, Pierce.
Yes, thanks, Mrs. McCoy. So we would have covered the other areas in the presentation as it relates to the elder abuse and so forth. So I think, Chair, unless there are any questions, then we could invite persons But in terms of the next steps, we will continue our deliberation as a committee and refine the options that have been presented to us in terms of the recommendations and to see how well they will fit in any legislation for the elderly, because we are concerned and ensuring that these persons are protected, cared for, and they can live dignified lives. Thank you so much, Chair.
What's the tenure of your committee, PS? How long do you expect to be engaged in your process?
Okay. We did discuss that at the last meeting, and we are hoping that within the next 6 months or before, that's the outer time limit, for us to have the recommendations coming from the committee refined and presented. Within 6 months.
Thank you, Chair. Just before you wrap up, just towards the end of your presentation, I see, and I think it's something that I'd love to hear from you on, the scope of the mandatory reporters for consider reporting abuse. So you have social workers, healthcare professionals, elder care providers, and law enforcement. Considering the prevalence of financial abuse, is there any proposal there for mandatory reporters from that sector?
Is there a proposal for mandatory what, Senator Longman?
Around financial abuse.
For mandatory what?
For mandatory reporters. So she has listed reports. She has listed the individuals or the agencies that we would want to see making the reports, considering financial or judiciary. I don't know.
So that is still under discussion, chairs, members. So it's an area that we can look at.
Because if I may also relate, you have a lot of situations where financial institutions, persons have old accounts lingering, languishing, and sometimes the family members are not aware, etc., etc. Shouldn't there be something that mandates these agencies to relate to the finances of the elderly? Just putting that there for your thoughts.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I wonder if I could just ask the PS and her team if you are looking, well, one, is there any kind of model law at the UN level governing the care and protection of older persons? That's my first question. And my second question is, if not, is there any kind of, are you looking at any jurisdictions in particular that you might wish to draw the attention of this committee to?
What are the legislation? Okay, so the UN is actually looking at revising the convention. What's the name of the convention? Rights of older persons. And John Paul, go ahead.
Yes, Madam Chair. I don't recall seeing a model law from the UN. I do know they have their convention. With regards to a particular jurisdiction, I don't think we would have honed in particular on one definite jurisdiction. The issue we're having is that most of our Caribbean neighbors, generally speaking, which we normally like to model our laws off of or actually take particular, mirror some of their provisions, don't have a legislation per se. You would note that Cayman does have one. One of the major issues that we have to overcome is that a lot of the countries or jurisdictions that have legislation related to elderly care are more mature than us. They have significantly more resources as well. So what we would have to...
Can you repeat that? They're what? Sorry?
They're a bit more mature than us, I would say. So in terms of the fact that they may be a first world country or developed, sorry, yes, they're more developed than us. So for example, in modeling our legislation, we'd have to take that into consideration. I know, for example, when we were looking at occupational safety and health, we did look at a lot of more developed countries and how they would deal with the issue. And when we tried to see how we could incorporate it in a Jamaican context, it really and truly just could not work. So that's another hurdle that we're going to have to try to overcome with this particular piece of legislation as well.
Okay.
This is one of the situations where different market drive different needs. And so we can't just import something and place it and hope that it fits. This is where now we're going to have to look at what are those provisions in law that we can specifically target and start with. And as we grow, we develop and we expand on the kind of legislation in evaluating how it works in the first instance, because we really want it to be able to meet certain requirements. And so we can always expand on this legislation as we go along. But it's certainly one that would fit in terms of our immediate needs. Let's treat it like that in the first instance.
Yes. Thank you, Senator Gale. Members, it is 12:06. I'm 6 minutes into the speaker's time. I don't like to be in the speaker's time. So if we could wrap up on that, and that therefore means, members, that I ask for your concurrence in deferring the confirmation of the minutes to the next meeting, given the timeline. I want to thank the Permanent Secretary and the team at the Ministry of Labour, Social Security. I want to thank, as always, our very faithful parliamentary technical team, Legislative Council, our Legal Reform Department, not part of the Parliament, but certainly one of our essential supporters here at the Parliament, and our ever faithful and hardworking committee clerk who sends me emails at 10 and 11 o'clock at night. Thank you very much. She definitely needs the award for the hardest working. Members, on the next occasion, we will, I'm going to ask the committee clerk just to round robin a schedule for us that I'm going to ask members. This is April 29th. I'm going to ask members to indicate their agreement or objection before the end of this week. So that would be before May 2nd, so that the committee clerk can make her, well, we don't have all members present here today. So for the members who, well, no, so May 7th it is, Madam Clerk? I'm sorry, May 13th, I beg your pardon, May 13th and May 27th. And members concur? Very well. So our next meeting will be May 13th, and we will also have a meeting on May 27th. And Madam Clerk, I ask that you just indicate to us the schedule of speakers by the end of this week so we can prepare. And if you could also ensure that those who are coming to make oral submissions have sent their presentations in ahead of time, so that the members can peruse it prior to the session. And with that said, might I have a motion for the adjournment of the meeting? Thank you, Senator Gale, seconded by Senator Longmore. The meeting is adjourned.
We want a piece for Jamaica.